flow. I think we're now definitely moving into Dante now. We've had some talks on texts and still images, and now we're going to move into the realm of moving images, live performance, and a true final live performance at the very end. So Bill Wilson, my colleague in religious studies, will introduce the afternoon speakers.
Let me extend a welcome back to all of you as well. It's my great privilege to introduce the first speaker for this afternoon, Professor Paul Cantor, who is the Clifton Waller Barrett Professor of English. Professor Cantor holds the PhD from Harvard and the AB from Harvard as well. He is the author of some 7 books, numerous articles, too many to cite at this point without taking up all of his time at the podium and of his many honors. He has served for some 8 years on the National Council on the Humanities, and he won the Best Paper Prize in Politics and Literature from the American Political Science Association. So, with great pleasure, Paul Cantor.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. Let me ask, how many of you were at the film screening yesterday? Okay, that's good. I will try not to repeat myself, and I will base my remarks. We saw excerpts from 3 films: a 1911 silent film dramatizing the Inferno, an odd 1935 American film called Dante's Inferno, starring Spencer Tracy and a very young Rita Hayworth. And then we looked at Dante's Inferno, the animated epic film created out of a video game based on Dante's Inferno. Now, we're getting perilously close to the end of this conference, and nobody has offered a theory yet. So I'm going to theorize what we're doing at this conference. And in fact, this subject of Dante in relation to Renaissance art, to movies, to television, it actually goes to the heart of something that has interested me for a long time. And that is the very active circulation between what we call popular culture and high culture. What I'm going to talk about is a mistake I think a lot of academics make. That is, people think you can draw a line between popular culture and high culture easily, and I don't think that's true. People think that the media are very different and closed off from each other. This is that awful Marshall McLuhan idea that the medium is the message, as if a message can't move between different media. We have this idea of media revolutions, again, something McLuhan popularized, that we have an era of print, and then we go to an era of film, and then to an era of TV, and so on, as if, you know, have you guys ever listened to radio? You know, it's still around. Television was supposed to replace radio, and we kind of theorize things as that's what happened, but it's not what happened. All the media are still with us, including print, thank God. So I'd like to use the material we've looked at and to suggest that here's a wonderful case of seeing this circulation process. Dante today is about the definition of high culture. You know, you look up high culture in the dictionary, there's a picture of Dante there. We think of Dante's Inferno as this epitome of high culture, totally divorced from popular culture. You would just see they're running TV ads in Italy based on Dante. That's what I'd like to talk about, the way high culture continuously is recycled through what we call popular culture. That's what keeps it alive and actually reveals the popular roots of high culture in the first place, what gave it its energy. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the history of Dante in Italian film, and early Italian film in general. And as I said yesterday, most of us think Italian film began with Fellini and De Sica, but in fact, Italy was at the forefront of filmmaking from almost the beginning. Film was an extraordinarily international art from its beginning. Again, more international in the silent era than since, because films could, you just put the titles up in your native language and you could take a film from anywhere in the world. And so in general, when film began in the late 19th century, it was this new medium, and like any new medium, it was so exciting as a new medium, people would go and watch anything. So I think the earliest, the Lumiere brothers were the first guys who figured out you could broadcast a film on a screen and really pack people into the theater. And I believe the first film ever theatrically displayed was about a train pulling into a station. There was no Alfred Hitchcock subplot about who was on the train. It was just a train pulling into a station, and people were just astounded. They flocked to see that train pull into the station. They'd never seen anything like it. And there are accounts of how people drew back in fear because they thought the train was going to run them over. They took illusion for reality. And you know, I'm guessing for about 6 months, they were showing movies of trains pulling into stations. But finally people said, you know, that's pretty boring. We've seen the train pull into the station. And it was a while before people realized this medium would be a narrative medium. It was originally moving pictures. That was the whole thing, that you show pictures moving. What's interesting though, as you start off a medium, it can survive just on its novelty value. But then people realize, hey, we gotta have some content in this. And one of the interesting things is that a new medium looks back to the old medium, and in particular tries to get the prestige of high culture for the new medium. And the Italians, in many ways, led the way in this. The earliest Italian movie I could find listed was from 1905, and it's called The Sack of Rome. The Italians always look back to Rome. They have these great legends, myths, historical stories, and they realize you can take this new medium and not just show a train pulling into a station, but Julius Caesar pulling into Rome. And it's interesting, in many cases we just have titles of these films. They did an Othello and a Macbeth. It's very typical of early cinema to get the prestige of Shakespeare for this new medium. There's an enormous genre of silent Shakespeare. And again, that sounds so ridiculous to us today. But clearly, these early filmmakers thought, well, if we can show people a Shakespeare story, this new medium will have legitimacy. Oddly enough, among the early Italian films is a Siegfried and a Parsifal. Now, Wagner was exceedingly popular throughout Europe at this point. But again, it's very paradoxical to us that a number of the early movies were operas. A very young Cecil B. DeMille did a silent movie of Carmen featuring Geraldine Farrar, who was the great Carmen at the Metropolitan Opera in New York at the time. I've actually seen it, and you know, she was a pretty good actress, but you know, it's Carmen without the music. But that was enough then. And they actually made 2 Last Days of Pompeii films in the silent era in Italy. And then we get the film we looked at a bit of yesterday, L'Inferno. And clearly this really was an effort to legitimize the cinema in Italy. Let's take our great national poet Dante and put him up on the screen. It was really a remarkable effort. I think it was the highest budget for a movie anywhere at that time. Clearly they saw that if we could get Dante on the screen, people would think this medium had arrived. I discovered actually yesterday an interesting law of the media. We saw 3 films, all of them had nudity in them. And so that in a way makes my point. Dante legitimates nudity. That is, you can put nudity in a film, well, it's Dante, it's the Inferno. So, this is high-minded moral stuff. So the fact that we have some nude scenes in it is fine. And I think that's one of the secrets of the success of these films. The Inferno was path-breaking. It was the longest movie that had ever been made up to that time. It showed that you could have audiences watch a movie that was nearly 2 hours long. I think it's in its original version. People had been theorizing 20 minutes is long enough for a movie. But here you had a long movie that succeeded, and along came a filmmaker named Pastrone in 1910. He did a Fall of Troy movie. In 1912, he did the first of many, many Quo Vadis movies. And then in 1914, Pastrone did a film called Cabiria, which is arguably the first cinematic masterpiece. I believe it was 3 hours long in the original cut. D.W. Griffith saw it, and really most people now, cinematic historians, think that Birth of a Nation and certainly Intolerance would have been impossible without this film. An interesting aspect about it is they brought in Gabriele D'Annunzio to write the titles. And so he is credited as the first high culture figure to participate in the low culture of the movies. And the titles are pretty fancy in this film. It's quite extraordinary. I remember the first time I watched it, it's the story of Hannibal largely, and when Hannibal's bringing the elephants over the Alps, I naively said, what an amazing back projection for 1914. I mean, you'd think it's really the elephants in the Alps. Well, of course it was really the elephants in the Alps. They had no back projection then. They just dragged a bunch of elephants up. And I bet they could not say at the end no elephants were harmed in the making of this movie. But that film was a worldwide success. And again, it really solidified the notion that this was now an art form. It's interesting, the first books of cinema criticism come out about this time, 1916. Rachel Lindsay wrote a book, The Art of Moving Pictures, which is the first book in America that takes seriously cinema as an art form. The year earlier, 1915, a similar book had appeared in Germany. So here we see the intersection of high culture with a medium is fairly typical of the history of media, that they come along and they actually gain traction, aesthetic traction, by referring to the past. If you go back to Aristotle's Poetics and chapter 4, where he offers a very brief history of tragedy, it's a bit surprising to us because what Aristotle says is that tragedy began as a rather low and vulgar form. He says it had slight subjects and humorous diction. And that sounds really weird to us. Tragedy had slight subjects and humorous diction. Now we forget, most of us, that in Greek, tragedy means goat song. That's all it means in Greek, is goat song. So if I said to you, goat song began with slight subjects and humorous diction, that might sound more plausible. In fact, what Aristotle suggests is what we know as the satyr plays. These plays that would come at the end of the trilogy of 3 Greek tragedies, that actually that was the beginning of the form. Originally, these were plays with a chorus interacting, chorus of satyrs interacting with Silenus or Dionysus. And from the little we know of satyr plays, they were pretty funny and in fact quite vulgar. And in effect what Aristotle says is somebody came along and took this new medium and used it to portray the stories from Homer. And that's the same logic I'm talking about with cinema. That is, you have a new medium, satyr play, goat song. it grips an audience just because it's new, they've never seen anything like it. And then somebody comes along, maybe it was Thespis, maybe it was Aeschylus, who says, I'm going to take this new medium and I'm going to do something great with it. I'm going to take our great heritage of stories from Homer and I'm going to use goat song to represent that. And again, it was much more paradoxical with Aeschylus or whoever did it, because goat song didn't have the associations we now have with the word tragedy. So again, I think you can see the early novels in English trying to attach themselves to Puritan narratives, Puritan confessionals that had a certain cachet, or Henry Fielding said the novel is the comic epic in prose, trying to get a bit of the prestige of the epic for this new form. So I think this is a law of media development that in fact the new media always anchor themselves in the content of the old media to get themselves established and respectable. Now the other side of this that I find interesting is the way the new media react back upon the old. And I'll just start with the fact that we now often say in class, I do it, that Dante's Inferno is cinematic. We talk about how Dante's eye moves in this work. Now it's obvious that Dante didn't think it was cinematic when he wrote it, but in effect, movies have taught us how to read earlier media in a different way. So that we now can know when we see a cinematic representation of Dante, we realize, yeah, there were cinematic elements in it. And the way Dante moves us through Inferno is the way a camera moves through different levels. And in fact, when you study the 19th century, you can see people were dying for the motion picture. They were trying to find one or another way of having pictures move. There were these panoramas, as they were called. There's a great one in Luzerne in Switzerland, where you could see the whole battle of Waterloo 360 degrees. There's one of these in the Metropolitan New York. Everybody talks about the opening of Charles Dickens' Bleak House as cinematic, the way the camera pans in on London. Thomas Edison came up with the technology, the Lumiere brothers perfected it, but in a way, 19th century art was crying out for the cinema, and it's only when we get the cinema that we can learn to read the cinematic elements back in 19th century literature and other arts. Now, we ended last time with a video game, and in fact, as Mr. Hufnagel was telling us, his students know the Dante's Inferno video game, and it helps them to approach high school students through that video game. Right now, I think most people would reject the video game as an art form. I'm on record saying that it's emerging as a genuine art form, and it also is teaching us something new about earlier art. This video game shows that the Inferno had many of the elements of a video game in it. It was encyclopedic. It has levels. What characterizes video games is they create worlds. And the worlds have depths of information. They have different peoples in them, different lands. They have different rules for the different people or the different lands. And that we can see that in earlier authors. Tolkien would be the best example. And there is a direct connection between Tolkien and these various wizard games, Dungeons and Dragons, and the development of video games. But when you look at Tolkien, the world he created has such depth. In some ways, his narratives are just the tip of the iceberg. But we learn the same thing about certain authors. Dickens would be one, William Shakespeare would be one, Dante would be another. That the video game teaches us to see that what some authors do is to create an entire world. And they people it, and yes, they work out some of the possibilities for that world, but as we've seen in the history of Dante's afterlife, there are lots of latent possibilities in the Inferno, in the Purgatorio, in the Paradiso, that have made these poems very attractive to later artists who want to tell us more about Paolo and Francesca. We haven't even discussed music in this conference, but there's Liszt Dante Symphony, there's Tchaikovsky's Francesca da Rimini. So again, maybe the jury's still out on how artistic video games are, but I think they have taught us about latent possibilities in earlier art. I know people have been working on creating video games out of Shakespeare. I'm surprised there isn't one out of Dickens. So that's what I mean when I say that there's circulation between high culture and pop culture. There's circulation between different media. The media are not simply cut off from each other. One medium doesn't just simply blow away the earlier medium. New media draw upon the content, the stories from the old media. New media reveal new possibilities in the old media. So I really am anti-McLuhan. I wrote an essay called "The Medium is Not the Message." I actually went back and reread some of McLuhan. I don't recommend it. And I discovered, you know, he defined television as a low-definition medium. That's literally his definition. Film is high definition, television is low definition. What would poor Marshall do with high definition TV? Is it not TV anymore? I think that's fairly typical about us. I will include myself as scholars that we tend to take a medium in a static view. We assume the way it is when we encounter it is the way it'll always be. McLuhan couldn't even conceive that someday people will be watching television at home on screens that are bigger than the screens they're watching it at the multiplex. So I believe we shouldn't scorn popular culture. We shouldn't try to cordon it off from high culture. We shouldn't be afraid of our students participating in pop culture, even in video games. They can learn something from it. I saw that Spencer Tracy, Dante's Inferno, as a child. I was fascinated by the hell sequence. I went and read Dante's Inferno. I didn't know what it meant, but I had a nice volume with the Doré illustrations, and it helped my imagination. I said, someday I'll read that book, and now I even teach it. So that's the lesson I would try to draw from, in a way, the whole conference, to see that, yes, we get upset when Dante and Beatrice get it on in the video game movie, and we really, that's not Dante, and yet there's something in Dante, some kind of cultural energy that does prevail and inspires these various transformations in Dante and other media. And I think, you know, if you look at Shakespeare, you look at Homer, there are so many other aspects where we see the interaction between high culture and popular culture, and I think it's a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a fine talk. Our next speaker is Professor Bernadette Luciano, who has a BA and an MA from Stanford and PhD from Columbia. Excuse me. Professor Luciano's research interests are in Italian women writers, Italian film, life writing, translation theory, and European studies, a wide-ranging set of interests. She is the co-author of Reframing Italy, Trends in Italian Contemporary Italian Women's Filmmaking, and the author of, I should say, the forthcoming, and in 2008, The Cinema of Silvio Salvini. It's a great pleasure to welcome her to our conference, and we eagerly await your words.
And as I do that, I'm just going to thank Deborah for inviting me to participate in this conference from far. Even before I got here, I said yes. And actually, it brings me back to What wasn't said was that when I did start my academic career at Columbia, my PhD dissertation was actually on, did have to do with Dante. It was on, just a minute, I can't multitask. Oh no, you're seeing everything. All right. It was on, my PhD advisor was a Milanese professor, and he, in the seminar on lyric poetry, he introduced me to the work of a poet known as Carlo Porta, who lived at the same time as Manzoni, a little bit in the shadow of Manzoni. And one of the things that Porta did was he was a great, we were talking yesterday about reference and reverence and homage, and he was a great admirer of Dante, both for what for the content of his comedy, but also for the language, and particularly for the dialect. So what he did is he translated 3 or 4 cantos of Dante's Inferno into Milanese dialect. And in fact, what he did in doing that was, because he felt constrained by the terzina, he actually used the form of the octave, so that would allow him 2 extra lines of verse to actually comment on the Inferno. What he found was that the Dante, the Inferno was a perfect context for him to talk about what was happening in late 18th century Milan, where the Austrians and the French were vying for power. So it was one of those things in which Dante lends himself to a revisionist view of history as well. So today I'm going to talk instead about Dante and Benigni, and these are, I've talked about this as reflections. They really are sort of reflections on what Benigni has done in his appropriation of Dante and in his performance of Dante. So his readings have actually been acclaimed for bringing the then into a now, for making Dante live in a context in which the medieval poet, the classics and the humanities more broadly, risk increasing marginalization. In Italian school curriculum, even though we've talked about how Dante is very much alive, he has been in revision of high school curriculum. He has been put a little bit on the margins. In universities, and as we know, the humanities are at risk in society as a whole. In a speech delivered for the conferring of one of the many honorary degrees that was bestowed upon him for these performances, Benigni was praised and honored for understanding the duality of comedy in filmmaking, in literature, and in the humanities in general. So working across medium, we might say, and for his intuitive affinities with Dante's Divine Comedy. The understanding that comedy encompasses pain, though ultimately it also suggests a transcendence of adversity and a celebration of life. These themes are present in a number of Benigni's works, probably some of the ones that you are most familiar with. Benigni writes an imaginary letter to Mr. Dante Alighieri, which has subsequently been put into the preface of the Hollander translation of Dante's Commedia. And one of the things he tells Dante Alighieri is he hopes that he's pocketing the royalties from Benigni's performance of Dante, because he's performed it so many times, and every time he has to pay. So he wants to make sure they're getting to Dante, even though Dante is well in purgatory at this time. In the letter, Benigni also thanks Dante for having taught him life's great paradox. Benigni tells Dante, and I'm quoting now, "It was you who made me experience both good and evil, made me go to sleep, frightened out of my wits, moved me to tears, and it was you who made me die of laughter." Dante, however, taught Benigni more than these kind of what we might call the oxymoronic nature of human life. He also instilled in him a love of poetry, with his mysteries and with his voice. And in paying tribute to Dante in the public squares of Italy and in the virtual public squares on television, Benigni has made an enormous contribution to the oral tradition, which has illustrious origins. As others have already said during this conference, the Lectura Dantes is a tradition inaugurated by Giovanni Boccaccio, who performed a series of public lectures that were commissioned by by the Florentine Commune in the Church of Santo Stefano in Badia between 1373 and 1374. And from then, the lectura Dantes have continued, and this also carries on in the tradition that was referred to yesterday of the Canta Storia, today by the way, the Canta Storia, and the lectura Dantes continue today, not only through the figure of Bernini. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to say might be the genesis of Bernini's lectures, and to do that we have to rewind to Bernini's childhood. For Bernini attributes his love for Dante to his mother. It's nice to get mothers in there. His mother who pushed him to learn the cantos by heart, and also to his father who encouraged him in the Tuscan oral tradition of improvisation to go around reciting poetry publicly on stage. He performed on Tuscan stages and at many instances of the Festa di Unità in Tuscany. Bernini gains national attention after moving to Rome, where he made his theatrical debut performing monologues in the guise of the Tuscan peasant character of Mario Cioni, which was later transformed from the experimental Roman theater to television, where he was in fact censored because of the nature of what monologues actually said, and to film, which was also the film was also unsuccessful, primarily because it was given a rating that it was prohibited for viewers under the 18 years of age. But the importance of this role in the formation of Bernini as actor, performer, comic, public critic is suggested by the director of the film made for Mario Cioni, Giuseppe Bertolucci, who was the co-author and the co-director of the piece, who in his preface to the text for Mario Cioni writes, Mario Cioni originates from an objective of the 1970s in full ideological storm of the oral accounts of a young Tuscan proletariat, which I gather and verbalize in the form of a monologue, offering that young man, Roberto Benigni, a kind of mirror in which he recognizes himself and discovers the quality and quantity of his immense comic talent. In Benigni's monologues, real life predominated. The personal, which as we all know is also always political, and in short, the will or the necessity to recount one's own business in public. The words that Bertolucci uses to describe Benigni's performance of Mario Cioni can be transferred to Benigni and his performances of Dante today. He talks about him standing quite immobilized with his hands by his side or often in his pocket, performing soliloquies whereby the most unthinkable associations, the entire life of a young country boy, enters little by little onto the stage. His living in, the fact that he's living in a frantic society, monologues full of bitter criticism, of irony and revolt, and these are key words, I think, that also describe what he does with the monologues. Blasphemy and tender, idiotic and genial, bizarre and common, all at the same time. A small masterpiece of unusual, charming workmanship. Now, Benigni owes much both to the Italian Commedia dell'arte and the Mass, but also to dramaturgy itself, to the importance of the script, because many of Benigni's monologues, while appearing very spontaneous, are often very carefully scripted. And we begin to actually see this in his films, where he becomes somewhat more famous. And these are films such as that he all makes, writing with Vincenzo Cerami, who's the screenwriter. So films like The Little Devil, Il Piccolo Diavolo from 1998, Gianni Stecchino, and The Monster. All of these films in which he also stars along his wife and favorite co-star, Nicoletta Braschi. Now, international fame comes after winning the Oscar for La Vita è Bella, and a film which explores the relationship between comedy and tragedy, and raises extensive debate over the appropriateness of comedy in dealing with certain subject matter. Now, his reception of this award, I would say, is an historical spectacle in itself. As in signature Benigni style, he transgressed Hollywood decorum, jumping up and down on the seats, hopping onto the stage, and embracing Sophia Loren, A speech that went on longer than Hollywood and the television sponsors would allow today. Benigni, after referencing Blake and Wordsworth, thanks everybody, including his parents, for the gift of poverty, and ends with a reference to love and the famous final lines of the canto, l'amor, the canto 33 Paradiso, l'amor che muove il sole e altre stelle. Much as I would love to show you this whole thing, it would take up the rest of the time, so we're going to stop right there, but you get an idea, you kind of see that, you get a little sense of Benigni's personality through that. Now Dante, the passion for poetry that Dante inspired, are referenced repeatedly in Benigni's films. His famous definition of poetry in his film The Tiger in the Snow features Benigni, this time a flamboyant professor of literature providing a lecture on poetry. I'm just going to show you just a couple of minutes of this, just again to show how, this is quite unusual, how poetry can actually become very cinematic.